Good afternoon, my name is Elena Fedorova. I represent the Siberian Federal University and the Federal Research Center for Information and Computational Technology of the Russian Academy of Science. The topic of our presentation is interfacial fracture behavior of a thermal barrier coating system on nickel-based superalloys. The results are obtained in collaboration with Andrei Burov and Nadezhda Sukhodoeva. I've divided our presentation into three main parts. I will start with a short introduction in order to explain the objectives of our work. Then I will present the results of microstructural characterization and results of numerical calculation using find elements methods in order to discuss the interfacial fracture behavior of studied system. The thermal barrier coating system, TBC, are widely used to protect the hot section structural components, such as aircraft gas turbine, more precisely turbine blades, or gas turbine for energy application, against oxidation and large thermal gradients during service life. TBC, thermal barrier coating system, on nickel-based superalloys is typically composed of three layers. The aluminum containing corrosion-resistant metallic bond coat, the thermally insulated ceramic top coat, and the thermally grown oxide TGO, predominantly alpha alumina. This layer forms during high temperature exposure under service conditions due to oxygen diffusion through the top coat and oxidation of aluminium presented in the bond coat. This TGO layer often causes the poor mechanical behavior and degradation of the system. This layer also forms the two most important interfaces where fracture typically occurs. One interface is between top coat and TGO, and second between bond coat and TGO. So, the main objectives of our work is to try to prevent TBC degradation. In this work, microstructural analysis of interfacial fracture of thermally grown oxide after short cyclic oxidation test and numerical calculation were carried out. The long-term objectives concern the prediction of the service life of thermal barrier coating system during long-term cyclic oxidation. The main cause of poor mechanical behavior of TGO is the mismatch of coefficient of thermal expansion of metallic and ceramic parts. The residual thermal stresses arise during cooling stage of thermal cycle, and they are of primary importance as their magnitude and distribution govern the durability of coating system. The mechanisms controlling the damage behavior in thermal barrier coating system have been extensively studied over the past 30 years by many others and described by Anthony Evans, Pindera, Hills, and other researchers. But I'd like to highlight here that find element model has been often developed only for one interface, TGO-TC or TGO bond coat. In our previous work, it has been shown that the TGO shape has a significant impact on the values of residual stress state for both interfaces. In the present work, based on our previous result, the interfacial fracture mechanism are discussed. The specimens of a turbine blade of single crystal nickel-based GS 32 superalloy coated with TBC obtained by electron beam physical vapor deposition. After cyclic oxidation test at 1100 degrees C, were cut and prepared for microstructure observation using conventional techniques. In this photo, you can see the summary of results of microstructural characterization. Main types of microstructural imperfections are listed here. You can see, for example, the first one, the internal oxidation zones. The second is the non-uniformities of TGO thickness and non-uniformity of chemical composition. The third type is cracks in top coat, and the fourth is cracks in TGO, thermally grown oxide. It was shown that for different samples the problem arises for both interfaces, alone thermally grown oxide TC interface and alone thermally grown oxide BC interface. First of all, the investigation of cooling rate effect was carried out. In our previous study, it was shown that for the TBC system with the regular interface geometry with uniform thickness of thermally grown oxide, the cooling rate has no significant effect on the residual stresses values in TGO. 5 various cooling rates from the stress-free temperature 1100 degrees C to room temperature were considered, so from really slow to really fast. You can see on this slide the values of minimal principal stresses, so compressive thermal stresses, depending on the wavelength of modeled representative microstructural areas. In contrast, the result of finite elements methods modeling shows that the geometry of the TGO layer and geometry of interfaces significantly influence on the magnitude and distribution of residual thermal stresses. You can see the distribution of the minimum principal stress calculated for the regular and irregular thickness of thermally grown oxide. For example, in the case of irregular shape, the compressive stress reaches the value of 2700, about this value, megapascals, at the peak for TGO-TC interface, which is almost 3 times higher in absolute value than the stresses developed at the same location in the thermal barrier coating system with the regular TGO layer geometry. The similar effect was observed in the peak area of the thermally grown oxide bond coat interface. The numerical analysis of stress-strain state and cracking behavior was performed using a two-dimensional model for 2 periodic units of thermally grown oxide profile. First of all, it was regular sinusoidal undulation with constant TGO thickness of about 7 millimeters, and the second type is irregular TGO with symmetrical sinusoidal penetration into the TC and BC layers. It was realized based on the representative backscattered electron image of localized penetration. The input data for numerical analysis are listed here. You can see different parameters. thermomechanical properties as a function of temperature and creep parameters of different TBC components were extracted from corresponding literature and provided by our industrial partners. To simulate the crack development along two interfaces, the bilinear cohesive zone model was used. And now I'd like to move on to the results of finite element method calculation for regular and irregular TGO profile. You can see in this slide, without considering interfacial and debonding firstly, you can see the distribution of residual stresses and a result of FEM modeling. For the regular TGO, the potential crack initiation sites are located at the peak of the thermally grown oxide BC interface and at the valley and the middle of thermally top coat and thermally grown oxide interface, where corresponding normal and tangential stresses are well above the critical values. In the case of irregular TGO, the stresses at the both interfaces exhibit a similar distribution pattern. However, the maximum normal stress located at the TGO-BC interfacial peak do not exceed 200 megapascal. Mod 1 debonding initiation was observed for this case. The debonding due to tangential contact stresses is most likely to occur at the middle of TC-TGO and TGO-BC interface. Now let's move on to the case with the interfacial debonding. For the regular TGO, the debonding upon cooling occurs along both the TC-TGO and the BC-TGO interfaces. The location of crack nucleation corresponds well to the distribution of normal and tangential stress. First on time, the cracks is initiated at the valley of the TC-TGO interface. Then the debonding progresses towards the peak location with the mixed mode mechanism. At the end of cooling, near all contact elements between TC and TGO layer are damaged. Later on, about 900 seconds after the cooling starts, that corresponds to 550 degrees C, the new debonding appears at the peak of the TGO-BC interface. The interfacial cracking develops, reaching the rate of 14 micrometers, but is then arrested at the aspirity middle due to the presence of high compressive stresses. The Mod 1 debonding is dominant in this damage process. For the case of irregular TGO, the debonding is first occurs at the middle of TC-TGO interface. Caused by a pure 2 mode, and the damage is developed towards the peak. There are no Mod 1 damage near the peak until the temperature drops to about 800 degrees C, or so 500 seconds of the cooling time. There is almost no damage along the TGO-BC interface except near the peak location. Sure that the debonding leads to the stress distribution in the TC and TGO layers, this effect is more significant. For example, for irregular geometry of TGO, the minimum principal stress in TGO, this layer, increase in absolute value by more than 15% compared with simulation without considering the interfacial debonding. And to conclude, in the case with the regular TGO layer appears to be more dangerous in terms of interfacial failure than that one with the irregular TGO shape. This conclusion contradicts with some of the experimental data. Spallation of the top coat was mostly observed near the TGO irregularity, so we were really surprised. The possible explanation, the other than delamination mechanisms could be responsible for TBC failure, and it may be high compressive stress in TGO that cause buckling of the layer if cracks formed at the interfaces are reached the critical ledge, or the second possibility, it may be the coalescence of the interfacial cracks and cracks within the TC and TGO layers. So we need to implement the Kaiser zone elements through the layers to understand these effects. And as usually, we highlight that significant influence of input data on the FEM result is observed. So we need to be really attentive to input data. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much for organizers. Thank you.